You didn't arrive here by accident. Something has been shifting beneath the surface of your life, quietly, invisibly, deliberately. What you thought was delay was preparation. What felt like silence was strategy. And in a moment you may not expect, everything is about to change. Here is part 1. Rewritten exactly according to Dan Y.A., written as a single flowing opening, deep, emotional, mysterious, and designed to hook the listener immediately and compel them to stay until the end. Something new is coming. Not later. Not someday. But now. And even as you hear those words, something inside you reacts. Part of you wants to believe them, while another part hesitates, almost afraid to hope again. Because you've been here before. You've prayed these prayers before. You've told yourself, this season will change, only to wake up to the same problems, the same pressure, the same unanswered questions. So let me ask you something honestly. What if the reason nothing looks different is because the change didn't start where you're looking? What if the shift you've been begging God for has already begun, but not in your circumstances, inside you? When you declare, something new is coming, you're not just saying hopeful words into the air. You are loosening the grip the past has had on your mind. You are interrupting the cycle of replaying what didn't work, what didn't happen, what broke your heart. Your soul begins to breathe again, because hope, real hope, doesn't come from evidence. It comes from alignment. And this is where many people miss it. We are trained to believe that if God is working, we should be able to see it clearly. Open doors. Obvious breakthroughs. Visible movement. But Scripture tells a very different story. God often moves first in the unseen, long before the visible ever catches up. That's why the word says, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7. Not by what we can prove. Not by what we can measure. But by what we perceive in the Spirit. Because sometimes the old season overstays its welcome. You're still facing the same resistance. Still praying the same prayers. Still waiting for a door that hasn't opened yet. And if you only look at the surface, you'll start believing the quiet lie that nothing is changing, that God has forgotten you, or that this is just how life will always be. But listen carefully. God does not lie. When He speaks, motion begins, even if you can't see it yet. The prophet Isaiah records the words of God saying, "See, I am doing a new thing, now it springs up, do you not perceive it?" Isaiah 43 verse 19. Notice what He doesn't say. He doesn't say, "Feel it." He doesn't say, "Figure it out." He says, "See." And in Scripture, seeing is not about eyesight. It's about spiritual perception. God is inviting you to recognize something that may not yet be visible, but is already real. Like a seed buried in the soil, breaking open in silence, unseen by anyone walking above the ground. Nothing on the surface tells the story of what's happening underneath, but that doesn't mean nothing is growing. In fact, the most important work often happens where no one is looking. And this is where faith becomes uncomfortable. Because faith requires you to agree with God before your circumstances do. It asks you to trust that something is shifting, even while the evidence still looks the same. That tension, the space between promise and manifestation, is where many people give up. Not because God stopped working, but because waiting became heavier than believing. But what if this waiting isn't empty? What if this moment, this exact season you're in, is pregnant with purpose? You see, the new thing God is doing in your life is not a recycled version of your past. It's not a patched-up repair of what already broke. It's not a rerun with slightly better conditions. It's something original. Something custom-designed. Something your old self could never carry. That's why it doesn't arrive loudly. That's why it doesn't announce itself with fireworks. That's why it often begins while you're still confused, still tired, still unsure. If God waited for everything to look ready before He moved, nothing would ever be born. And maybe that's why you've felt unsettled lately. Why the old patterns don't fit anymore. Why the old comfort zones feel tight. Why what used to work, suddenly doesn't. That discomfort is not rejection. It's preparation. You are not being pushed backward. You are being repositioned. So before you decide that nothing is happening, pause. Breathe. And consider this possibility. What if the reason you're sensing restlessness is because something new is already stirring? What if God is asking you not to see with your eyes, but to perceive with your spirit? Because if you can perceive it, even just a little, then you need to know this. It has already begun. And before this message ends, you may realize that the very season you thought was barren is the place where God has been quietly preparing your breakthrough all along. There is a difference between looking and seeing, and most people don't realize how wide that gap truly is. Looking is passive. Seeing is intentional. Looking gathers information from the surface, but seeing requires discernment. And when God says see, He is not asking you to analyze your circumstances harder, He is inviting you to develop spiritual perception. The kind of perception that recognizes movement before results, alignment before evidence, and promise before fulfillment. This is where faith separates itself from optimism. Faith does not wait for proof in order to respond. Faith responds because God has spoken, even when the ground still looks unbroken. Scripture defines it clearly. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Hebrews 11 verse 1. Notice that faith itself becomes the evidence. Not the outcome. Not the manifestation. Faith is the evidence that something is already real in the unseen realm. And this challenges the way we naturally think. We want to see progress before we believe progress exists. We want clarity before commitment. We want certainty before obedience. But spiritual perception works in the opposite direction. It trains your inner vision to recognize what God is forming beneath the surface, even when your natural senses report nothing has changed. This is why two people can walk through the same season and experience it completely differently. One sees delay. The other sees development. One sees silence. The other recognizes preparation. The difference is not intelligence or experience, it is perception. Spiritual perception does not deny reality, but it refuses to be ruled by it. If you rely only on what your eyes can confirm, you will misinterpret seasons where God is intentionally working quietly. You will mistake hidden growth for stagnation. You will assume God is absent when He is, in fact, deeply involved. And the danger is not just discouragement, the danger is disengagement. When you believe nothing is happening, you stop preparing for what's coming. Jesus addressed this very tension when He spoke to Thomas after the resurrection. Thomas wanted physical proof before he would believe. Jesus met him in his doubt, but He also revealed something deeper when He said, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." John 20 verse 29. That blessing is not about ignorance. It is about trust. It is about the ability to recognize truth without demanding visible confirmation first. Because God often does His most important work in places that cannot be observed. Think about how growth actually happens. Seeds do not sprout above ground the moment they are planted. First, they break apart. They disappear into darkness. They undergo a process that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. But beneath the soil, pressure is building. Life is forming. Direction is being set. If you dig up a seed every day to check if it's growing, you will kill the very process you're hoping to witness. In the same way, spiritual perception requires patience. It requires restraint. It requires the humility to say, "I don't see it yet, but I trust what God is doing." This is not passive waiting, it is active believing. It is choosing to align your thoughts, expectations, and decisions with a future that hasn't arrived yet. And this is where many people struggle. Because perception demands surrender. It asks you to release the need to control outcomes and timelines. It invites you to stop obsessing over visible signs and instead cultivate sensitivity to God's voice. It shifts your focus from asking, "Why hasn't it happened yet?" to asking, "What is God forming in me right now?" When you learn to see spiritually, you begin to notice subtle changes. Your reactions soften. Your hope stabilizes. Your anxiety loosens its grip. Not because everything around you suddenly improves, but because something within you has realigned. You stop measuring God's faithfulness by speed and start trusting His process. And this kind of perception changes how you move forward. You begin to prepare instead of panic. You begin to steward instead of striving. You begin to speak life instead of rehearsing fear. You recognize that delay is not denial and that silence does not mean absence. You understand that God is not rushed, confused, or reacting. He is intentional. Spiritual perception allows you to live ahead of the moment without escaping the present. It anchors you in hope while your circumstances are still catching up. It teaches you to walk steadily even when the path isn't fully lit, trusting that the next step will appear when you need it. And here is the quiet truth most people miss. God does not reveal everything at once because clarity too early can interrupt formation. If you could see the full picture before your character was ready, the weight of it might crush you. So God reveals in stages. He allows perception to grow before manifestation. He trains your eyes of faith so that when the moment comes, you are not shocked by the blessing, you are prepared for it. So if you sense something shifting but can't explain it, don't dismiss that awareness. That may be perception awakening. That may be the beginning of learning how to see what God sees, rather than what circumstances suggest. Because once your vision changes, your interpretation of everything else begins to change with it. And that kind of seeing will carry you safely into what comes next. There is a moment in every unseen battle when silence becomes heavier than noise, when you realize that what has been fighting you was never meant to be confronted with human strength. This is the stage where many people grow tired, confused, and spiritually numb, not because God is absent, but because the conflict has moved beyond the natural realm. What you are facing cannot be explained by logic alone. It is not just pressure, opposition, or bad timing. It is resistance aimed at delaying what God has already authorized in heaven. Scripture makes something sobering and clarifying unmistakably clear. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Ephesians 6 verse 12. That verse does not exist to scare you. It exists to wake you up. The exhaustion you feel is not weakness. It is evidence that you have been fighting the wrong enemy with the wrong tools. You were never meant to win spiritual wars using emotional endurance or mental resilience alone. This is where God begins to shift your understanding. He does not always remove the battle immediately, but He reveals its true nature so you can stand differently within it. When God opens your eyes, you stop reacting and start discerning. You stop defending yourself emotionally and start standing spiritually. What once felt overwhelming begins to lose its authority, not because the enemy disappears, but because its power is exposed. There is a reason the attacks intensified right before clarity arrived. Darkness always resists exposure. The enemy thrives in confusion, delay, and misdirection. But when God allows you to see that the conflict is spiritual, He is also granting you access to spiritual authority. Awareness is not the end goal. Alignment is. An alignment with God shifts the atmosphere even before circumstances change. The enemy's strategy is often subtle. It is not always chaos. Sometimes it is weariness. Not always fear. Sometimes it is distraction. Not always temptation. Sometimes it is discouragement disguised as logic. You begin to question yourself, your calling, your timing, even God's voice. But these questions are not signs of failure. They are signs that something valuable is being contested. This is why God does not rush this stage. He is training your spirit to recognize patterns, to sense resistance without panic, to remain steady under pressure. The strength being formed in you here is not visible yet, but it is foundational. You are learning how to stand without immediate answers, how to trust without instant relief, how to remain obedient without applause. These are not small lessons, they are the marks of spiritual maturity. And here is the turning point many people miss. When the battle becomes spiritual, God becomes your defender in ways you cannot replicate on your own. You are no longer fighting for victory, you are standing from a place of victory. The burden shifts from striving to trusting, from reacting to resting. This is why Scripture declares, "The Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still." Exodus 14 verse 14. Stillness here does not mean passivity, it means confidence. It means knowing that the outcome is not dependent on your emotional stability but on God's faithfulness. This is the stage where intimidation loses its grip. The voices that once felt loud begin to fade. The pressure that once suffocated you starts to loosen. Not because everything has changed yet, but because you have. You are no longer fighting blindly. You are standing in truth, covered by authority, anchored in purpose. What feels like delay is actually positioning. God is not only protecting the promise, He is protecting you from stepping into it unprepared. The spiritual resistance you have felt was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to develop discernment, endurance, and unshakable trust. And once those are formed, the enemy no longer has leverage. This is not the end of the story. It is the moment before reversal. The atmosphere is already shifting, even if you cannot see it yet. Heaven has taken notice of your perseverance. What was hidden is being exposed. What was blocked is about to be cleared. And what has been fighting you in secret will soon lose its power in the open. There comes a point in this journey when God does something that feels both terrifying and relieving at the same time. He begins to expose what has been hidden. This is not exposure meant to shame you, but revelation meant to free you. What once operated quietly in the background, manipulation, deception, spiritual sabotage, unseen opposition, can no longer remain concealed. Light does not negotiate with darkness, it confronts it. And when God turns on the light, nothing false can survive. This stage is uncomfortable because exposure disrupts familiarity. Even pain can feel familiar when you've lived with it long enough. But God does not heal by covering wounds. He heals by revealing their source. Suddenly, patterns begin to make sense. Delays that felt random are shown to be resisted. Relationships that drained you are revealed for what they were. Doors that closed were not rejection but protection. You realize that God was not ignoring your prayers. He was strategically shielding you. Scripture assures us that exposure is not an accident. It is a promise. For there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. Luke 12 verse 2. When God discloses what was hidden, He is not catching up, He is taking control. What the enemy relied on secrecy to accomplish, God dismantles through truth. This is where fear begins to lose its power, because fear cannot survive clarity. At this point, you may notice a shift in the atmosphere around you. Conversations change. Resistance weakens. Confusion lifts. It is not that the opposition has suddenly grown stronger, it is that it has been uncovered. Exposure strips the enemy of intimidation. Once you see clearly, you stop blaming yourself for battles that were never internal. You stop internalizing attacks that were never personal. Your peace begins to return, not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer deceived. God's exposure is also an act of justice. He does not overlook what has been done in secret. He does not dismiss tears that fell in silence. He does not ignore prayers whispered in exhaustion. The Word declares, He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of the heart. 1 Corinthians 4 verse 5. This means nothing that opposed God's will for your life gets the final word. Not betrayal. Not spiritual resistance. Not unseen schemes. What is powerful about this stage is that God exposes without requiring you to fight. You are not called to defend yourself, prove your innocence, or explain your story. God becomes your witness. Truth begins to speak louder than accusation. What once felt like injustice starts turning into vindication. And vindication does not always come with noise, sometimes it comes with undeniable peace. You may also notice that as things are exposed, some connections fall away naturally. This is not loss, it is alignment. God removes what cannot go where He is taking you. Exposure clears the path. It removes weight you were never meant to carry forward. It ends cycles that were quietly draining your strength. And while it may feel lonely for a moment, it creates space for what is real, healthy, and ordained. This is the moment when many people realize just how closely God has been watching all along. Not one detail escaped Him. Not one attack went unnoticed. Not one tear was wasted. Exposure is proof that God is involved down to the smallest detail. He is not distant. He is precise. What was hidden is losing its grip. What operated in the shadows is being dismantled. And what once worked against you is now working to refine you. This is not the climax yet, but it is the clearing before the breakthrough. The stage is being set. The atmosphere is shifting. And the same light that exposed the enemy is now illuminating the path forward. There comes a sacred transition after exposure, a quieter but more profound work that God begins to do within you. This is the stage where restoration moves beyond circumstances and reaches your inner world. God does not simply remove what was wrong, He rebuilds what was weakened. Strength returns, but not the kind that rushes or proves itself. This strength is settled. It is anchored. It carries discernment instead of anxiety and authority instead of fear. At this point, you may notice that your reactions are changing. What once triggered panic now meets calm. What once tempted you to explain yourself now meets silence. This is not emotional numbness, it is spiritual maturity. God is restoring your ability to stand without striving. He is teaching you how to remain steady even when answers are incomplete. Restoration is not about feeling powerful, it is about becoming unshakable. This is also where God begins to realign your identity. You stop seeing yourself through the lens of what you survived and begin seeing yourself through the lens of who He has called you to be. You are no longer defined by loss, delay, or opposition. You are reintroduced to yourself, clearer, wiser, and more grounded than before. Scripture speaks directly to this divine exchange. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Psalm 23 verse 3. Restoration is not random, it is guided. God restores you with intention, direction, and purpose. As your inner world stabilizes, your faith deepens. You no longer need constant signs to trust God's presence. You begin to recognize His hand in subtlety, in timing, restraint, and peace. Faith matures when it no longer depends on urgency. You trust God not because you see immediate results, but because you have learned His character. This kind of faith cannot be shaken by delays or detours because it is rooted in relationship, not outcomes. God also restores your voice in this season, not necessarily to speak louder, but to speak with clarity. You know when to speak and when to remain quiet. You stop giving energy to arguments that drain your spirit. You stop revisiting places God has already healed. Restoration teaches you stewardship over your peace. You begin to guard what God has rebuilt because you understand the cost of rebuilding it. The word promises that restoration always carries fruit. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken but endures forever. Psalm 125 verse 1. Endurance becomes your testimony. Not dramatic victories, but consistent faithfulness. Not emotional highs, but sustained peace. You are no longer chasing stability, you are living from it. This is also the season where God restores your capacity to hope again. Hope returns carefully at first, almost cautiously, but it grows stronger as you realize that disappointment no longer controls your expectations. You hope with wisdom now. You trust without naivety. You believe without pressure. God is not just healing what broke, He is strengthening what will carry you forward. What makes this stage powerful is that it prepares you for what comes next without announcing it. God does not rush restoration because what He restores must last. He is anchoring you deeply so that future blessings do not overwhelm you and future challenges do not destabilize you. You are becoming someone who can carry increase without losing peace. Restoration is not the end of the story, but it is a turning point. You are no longer reacting to what happened. You are responding to who God is. Your soul is steadied. Your vision is clearer. Your faith is quieter, stronger, and more resilient. And from this place of wholeness, God is preparing to move you forward. Not hurried, not broken, but fully restored and firmly established. Now comes the moment that many sensed long before they could explain it, the crossing into what God prepared while you were waiting. This is not a sudden miracle dropped from the sky. It is a fulfillment that arrives quietly but firmly, built on everything God has done within you. What opens next does not shock your spirit. It fits it. You step forward not as someone chasing relief, but as someone aligned with purpose. This is how God confirms that a new season has truly begun. At this stage, God no longer speaks primarily about what He is removing, but about where He is leading. Direction becomes clearer. Decisions feel steadier. You are no longer moving out of desperation but out of discernment. Doors that once intimidated you no longer feel heavy. You do not enter them trying to prove anything. You enter knowing that grace has already gone ahead of you. Scripture captures this assurance when it says, "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland." Isaiah 43 verse 19. What God promised before is no longer distant. It is unfolding. This season carries a different kind of confidence. You are not rushing because you trust God's timing. You are not anxious because you recognize His presence. You begin to understand that the waiting was not punishment, and the delay was not denial. It was preparation. God was shaping your character to match the calling, strengthening your discernment to protect the destiny, and deepening your faith so you could walk forward without fear of collapse. What is striking now is how naturally things begin to align. Opportunities connect without strain. Conversations carry clarity. Favor shows up without manipulation. This does not mean there will be no challenges, but challenges no longer define the atmosphere. Peace does. God establishes you not in chaos, but in order. The Word confirms this foundation. The Lord will establish you as His holy people, as He promised you on oath. Deuteronomy 28 verse 9. Establishment is God's way of saying that what He starts now is meant to last. You also begin to notice a shift in how you view the future. Fear no longer narrates it. Anxiety no longer controls it. You look ahead with sober hope, not fantasy, not pressure, but trust. You understand now that God does not reveal everything at once because He wants relationship, not just results. And you have learned how to walk with Him step by step, without needing to see the entire road. This is where obedience becomes simpler. You are not obeying to earn blessing, you are obeying because you recognize God's voice. Alignment feels less like sacrifice and more like relief. You are no longer divided between what God asks and what you want. Desire has been refined. Vision has been purified. You want what sustains peace, not what feeds ego. You choose what builds life, not what impresses others. As this chapter closes, There is no dramatic ending, only quiet certainty. God has done exactly what He said He would do. He carried you through what you could not survive alone. He exposed what needed to be revealed. He restored what was broken. And now He positions you for forward movement with stability, wisdom, and grace. You are not stepping into something fragile. You are stepping into something established. This is not the reward for endurance, it is a continuation of faithfulness. God does not bring you here to pause. He brings you here to live, to walk steadily, to build wisely, to love deeply, to serve faithfully, and to trust Him not only in crisis, but in clarity. What lies ahead will require faith, but not fear, courage, but not striving, dependence, but not desperation. You are ready, not because you are perfect, but because God has been faithful at every stage. And the same God who met you in the waiting will walk with you in the fulfillment. This is how a season truly ends, not with relief alone, but with peace. Not with noise, but with confidence. Not with escape, but with purpose. And as you move forward now, you do so knowing that what God begins, He completes, and what He establishes, no one can undo.